Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to Berkeley alumni and friends joining us from all around the world. My name is Ann Xu, and I am a board member of the California Alumni Association Chinese Chapter, or CAA Chinese Chapter for short, the sponsor of today's event. For those who don't know, the CAA Chinese Chapter is a descendant of the Chinese Student Club formed over 100 years ago to help ethnic Chinese students overcome social and economic barriers while attending UC Berkeley. It is one of the oldest chapters of CAA's 75 chapters. In addition to organizing numerous events in the past, the Chinese chapter has, along with our sister organization, the UC Chinese Alumni Foundation, endowed over 35 scholarships, which are awarded every year to deserving students at Cal, by far the most given by any individual or organization at Cal. The CAA Chinese chapter helped to raise funds for the East Asian Library over a dozen years ago, and we helped to launch the Berkeley China Summit 5 years ago. More recently, we started supporting students who take the Chinese American history class at Cal for them to make short videos that document important aspects of Chinese American history. The Chinese chapter was awarded Chapter of the Year 6 times by the CAA, and we continue to sponsor social and professional gatherings on topics that support our members and those related to Chinese culture, current society, and China's increasing role on the world stage. While you only see me on screen, our whole Chinese chapter board is actually in the audience today. I'd like to acknowledge our 3 co-presidents, Victor Chan, Steve Chan, and Carolyn Gan. I also want to give special thanks to our past president, Bak Chan, who coordinated today's event. An Tran, the Chief Program Officer at CAA, is also in the audience, and we'd like to thank the CAA for their ongoing support over the years. We have close to 500 registered attendees today, showing just how important this topic is to so many of us. Again, my name is Ann Xu, and I'm your moderator for today. So let's get started. Everyone here today is aware of the heightened economic and political tension between the United States and China, manifesting itself most notably in the pandemic blame game and ongoing trade war. Are Chinese Americans caught in the middle of this tension? Most definitely. And by the large number of people who are tuning in today, many of us agree. But what about the heightened racial tensions and dialogue between Black and white Americans just in the past 3 weeks? What's the role of Chinese Americans in this dialogue? We are extremely fortunate today to have joined us one of the foremost experts on issues related to Chinese Americans or ethnic Chinese in America, regardless of citizenship, Professor Frank Wu. The format of today's event is that Professor Wu will share his thoughts for about 30 minutes, and then I will moderate the Q&A session for another 25 to 30 minutes. Some of you have submitted questions beforehand, and others are welcome to type your questions in the chat box of your YouTube live stream. Now let me introduce our esteemed speaker. Frank Wu was born in the Motor City of Detroit, Michigan, to parents who came to study in the United States from Taiwan. He was made to endure Chinese school, like almost all Chinese kids born in America. He said he dropped out, but I guess despite the trauma, he received his bachelor's degrees from Johns Hopkins University and his law degree from University of Michigan. He taught and served as Dean of Wayne State University Law School in his hometown of Detroit, then taught for a decade at Howard University, the nation's leading historically Black college or university. Professor Wu then became the Chancellor and Dean and Distinguished Professor at UC Hastings Law School in San Francisco for the past 10 years. He served as Chairman, then President of the Committee of 100, a nonpartisan leadership organization of prominent Chinese Americans in business, government, academia, and the arts. Professor Wu is the author of the book, Yellow: Race in America Beyond Black and White. In a few days, Professor Wu will be leaving our fair city of San Francisco for the very exciting city of New York to take up his new role as the president of Queens College, City University of New York. We are very fortunate for him and grateful for him for taking time from his busy schedule to talk with us today. Professor Wu, please take it away.
I am honored and humbled by the terrific turnout, and I look forward to engaging in dialogue with everyone. Thank you so very much for joining us. Good evening and good morning. 我是吴华阳，在美国出生，在美国长大。今天晚上用英文跟你们讲。I just said, for those of you not fluent in Mandarin, and don't be fooled, I'm not fluent either. 我只是假装 said I'm just faking it. I explained I'm Frank Wu. I was born in America, grew up in America, and I'll be speaking to you in English today. So it's important for me to say that because of the suspicion these days of people of Asian descent, not just Chinese, that we're spies or sleeper agents, and the blame that's being cast that we are culpable, that it is due to our people that the economy worldwide has been brought to its knees due to this global pandemic. Those are just some of the issues that make this an unprecedented moment in human history. We also have the longstanding racial disparities that have come to the forefront with issues of police violence and racial profiling and the divide between black and white, which prompts many Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans to wonder, where do we stand? How do we fit in this paradigm that casts people and categorizes them as forever divided in one of two boxes? Well, this evening, I'd like to provoke you to think for yourselves, not persuade you to think as I do, by addressing one of the most difficult issues. In a time of US-China tensions, where do we stand? People who are proudly Chinese American. I'll start with a little bit of history, then talk about the context for some of the concerns, and finally discuss some of the cases that you've seen in the headlines as part of the government prosecution of scientists and students. We'll have ample time for Q&A because dialogue is at the heart of our diverse democracy. Last year, 2019, was the 150th anniversary of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, when a golden spike was driven in at Promontory Point, Utah. It realized manifest destiny, the notion since the Pilgrims and the founders that America would stretch from sea to shining sea. Many of you know, and perhaps some of you are even descended from those workers, that the entire Western line was built by 10 to 15,000 Chinese laborers who had been recruited for the backbreaking, heroic effort, blasting with unstable dynamite through sheer granite wall, sometimes giving their lives in this massive infrastructure project that people weren't even sure would be finished. It was the subject of great speculation. That's where that term, Chinaman's chance, comes from, because when you were lowered in that wicker basket with explosives to do the work, there was a good chance you wouldn't emerge alive. And yet that history was long obscured. During the celebrations, the then new technology of photography was used. And when you look at the famous images, you'll see that there isn't a Chinese face to be seen in the crowd. They were excluded, just as literally not long thereafter, because of congressional actions, both parties agitating. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was passed with an express ethnic basis to keep out those very people who had contributed so much to the making of this nation. People don't realize, though, that the Chinese and indeed the Asian presence precedes even that. If you go back to the American Civil War fought between 1861 and 1865, you will find that there were not just dozens, but hundreds of Asian men. Researchers have looked at the rosters of the Union and Confederate armies to confirm this. They've even written books. You can do what everyone does these days. If you're skeptical, just Google it and you'll see that an official National Park Service book containing photos was produced to document how there were Asian immigrants even at that time. There have been so many changes, though, with migration, and I'd like to highlight a few of them. These aren't just my say so, it's not just anecdote. If you look at all the statistics, you'll find that this is true. So, after 1882, there continued to be a few people of Chinese descent coming. You could even argue that it was the Chinese who were the original undocumented immigrants, illegal. Some of you may know that people came in as so called paper sons. They had false papers, they changed their name. They memorized a whole story about the village that they were from in order to deceive the immigration and customs officials. Because since in 1906 there'd been the earthquake and fire in San Francisco, the records had been destroyed, and they could claim that they were descended from a man, a father, who had been here before then, and they should be allowed in, or that even that they themselves had been present before the laws were passed. That was a falsehood. Sometimes it was a cousin or a clan member, but sometimes it was just someone from the same province who had secured passage and purchased the papers. Then there was just a little bit of migration, not much at all, but people don't know that the Chinese then played an important role in national debates. Though they are stereotyped as passive and submissive and deferential, they fought their way up to the United States Supreme Court again and again and again, sometimes winning in cases such as Wong Kim Ark, which established birthright citizenship that so many of us take for granted, and in so many other cases. When World War II started, China was an ally of the United States. That led during the war and after to repeal of the exclusion. And ultimately, as many of you know, and many of you or your parents were beneficiaries, in 1965, the laws were changed. A new immigration policy was adopted that eliminated the former racial and ethnic quotas and offered the opportunity for so many who could not have come legally at all. But starting in 1965, they could. And that worked a transformation. There are three changes in the migration of Chinese that I'll highlight. The first is the origin. From World War II, for about two generations, about 40 years, most of the people coming came from Taiwan or Hong Kong or the Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore. They were the Chinese diaspora, not coming from the mainland of China, because it was very difficult then for people to leave. So if you look statistically, it's more than 10 to 1, the ratio of people coming from Taiwan and Hong Kong as compared to mainland China. Starting in the mid 80s, that changed. So the first very significant change now is it's an entire reversal of the picture from the time that my parents arrived in the early 1960s. I'm 53. I was born in 1967 here in the United States, and my parents had arrived just a few years earlier as scholarship students in that bygone era when the United States sought to recruit people from overseas. So when they came, it was predominantly a migration that included people such as themselves, people from Taiwan or Hong Kong. And now it is predominantly, indeed, overwhelmingly, people coming from the People's Republic of China and in very significant numbers, as well as, of course, foreign exchange students. Before the pandemic, 350,000 to 400,000 people of Chinese descent came to the United States every year to study. So these are foreign nationals who intend to stay for just a few years, complete their studies or a postdoc or a stint as a research scholar, and then perhaps apply for an opportunity to stay or to return to Shanghai or Shenzhen. So the changes, the first is the origin, but the second, as important, is the ascent of Asia. I'll give you a personal way to think about this. When my father arrived, he's still with us, he's in his mid 80s. He told me that when he was a teenager and then a college student, when he was in China, in Nanjing, and then in Taiwan, in Taipei, they weren't vegetarians. They ate meat, but it was typically on a special occasion, or if you had a little bit with your dinner, it was about this much. It was a little bit of beef as a condiment, or a little bit of pork in a dumpling, perhaps. But he came to America and he realized even if you weren't rich, you could have an 8-ounce steak, and you could do that more than once per year. And so, just if you look at the consumption of meat as a measure, he found that in a single week, he could eat as much meat and afford to, even on modest means, as he would have eaten in a year back where he had come from. Well, all that has changed. Now, major movies are released in China when they're released in the United States. Whatever brand name, whatever luxury good you want to buy, if you're a connoisseur of fine wine, if you're a collector of avant-garde art, if you want the fanciest automobile that's exotic and a sports car, well, you'll find that the market has shifted to the other side of the Pacific Ocean. So there's been an ascent of China in particular, but Asia more generally. And this, for many, has caused alarm and anxiety because it fits with a theme: the rise of the East, the decline of the West, which causes people to look at you if you have this color of skin and texture of hair and shape of eyes and ask, which side are you on? The third change that's occurred is technology. Again, I'll give you a personal example. When I was growing up, my mother used to write every day to her mother with an airmail envelope. Some of you are old enough to remember that, on light blue paper, and you would fold it so it'd be lightweight and cheaper, and you would write on the inside and write on the back and cover every surface, and there was no envelope. The letter, that paper folded onto itself to be the envelope. And she did that because you couldn't place an international phone call. It would have been prohibitively expensive. The connection would be uncertain. Maybe to announce the birth of a child or something of that significance, you might do that and be on the line for a minute or two. But when my parents left Asia, they actually thought that perhaps they would never again see their own parents. That's changed. We have platforms such as this. We have our smartphone. So if you do move, you can continue to be transnational at virtually no cost. You can have the same boyfriend or girlfriend as before. You can share viral cat videos. You can have a sense of community that's transnational. This is such a change that it has upended everything that we do, all the assumptions and social norms that we have. So for a long time, Chinese immigrants were agents of foreign influence, but in the other direction. What I mean by that is many people of Chinese descent from even before the establishment of the modern Chinese nation sought to play a bridge building role. Sun Yat-sen, for example, who spent time in Hawaii, then US territories, was greatly influenced by the ideals and the principles and what he learned when he went to school while living with his older brother. And so many others sought, regardless of what side they were on or what party they were with, sought to use what they had gathered from America to help improve China. So there was a sense of optimism, not just on the part of the Chinese immigrants and their American born children, but on the part of American society as a whole, especially because the US and China were such allies during World War II. Today, there's a tremendous diversity within the Chinese American community. And as I turn to the second part of the talk, the context for all these issues, I do want to mention how the Chinese American community, as well as the Chinese in America, are so different. We have, for example, people who are sixth generation Californians, or even at this point, seventh generation, the descendants of the railroad workers. They actually have an association, and they celebrated last year in Utah as an official part of the Golden Spike 150 festivities. There are people who are the third generation or fourth or fifth in the Chinatown of Manhattan, or of Flushing, Queens, where I'll be moving. It was their grandparents who came. Sometimes it was the grandfather who came and went back and forth, shuttling because of the laws then. And then their father came, and then they were born here. But there are those who have been here for far longer than the demagogues who would push them out have been here. Their families can trace their ancestry back to the Civil War or even earlier. In part, that's thanks to mixed marriages. There are Chinese Americans whose ancestors came on the Mayflower. And when I say that, people think that's absurd, but it's entirely possible because they're Anglo-Asian. They could belong to an august organization such as the Daughters of the American Revolution, which was once racially and ethnically exclusive, because on the Anglo side, they meet the criteria. There are also those people who are in that pejorative phrase, which is being reappropriated thanks to a hit TV show, quote unquote, fresh off the boat. There are people who are adopted. Everyone knows someone, typically female, who's been adopted from an orphanage in China. There are people of Chinese Jamaican background, for example, including noted supermodels. So there's a tremendous diversity now. Those who are fully assimilated, those who are not interested in being Asian American. They aren't Asian. They don't embrace a pan-Asian identity. They're much more proudly Chinese and specifically Chinese. And they don't intend to be American either. And I respect that. Some of these are our literal or figurative cousins. And so there's been so much change. This year we saw the improbable to many surprise of Andrew Yang running for president. He became a national star with a following on social media, the Yang Gang, famous for his long scarf that showed the American flag and appearing in a presidential debate without wearing a tie. He really made it further than almost anyone predicted, drawing crowds of hundreds, even thousands, as he campaigned with his ideas of promoting humanity first. There are people of Chinese descent in every walk of life. There are athletes like Jeremy Lin, whose Linsanity was similarly so unexpected. And statistically, you can point to those numbers and say he did better in his phenomenal rookie season than any basketball player before him had ever done. In objective terms, not my opinion, not anyone's, but if you just look at how well he played and how he scored. There are Chinese Americans who have served honorably in the military next to people named Smith or Sanchez, no different than them, loyal to this nation, including those women who joined during World War II when it was so difficult for someone who was both a minority and female, who served as a WAC or a WAVE. Some of them, their stories are now being told. Yet what has happened with the rise of China, and now we turn to the second part of my talk, is this concern, a longstanding concern about the yellow peril, that Chinese immigrants are the vanguard of an invasion. They're sojourners, tourists, people who can never become real Americans. It's that question that we're asked when people say to me, "Where are you from?" And I reply, "Detroit," and they furrow their brows, they shake their heads, and say, "No, that's not what I mean. Where are you really from?" They ask. And when I confess that it was China, they say, "Oh, I thought so." Mm-hmm. There's nothing wrong with saying you're from China. That's what my parents would have said. But I am a kid from Detroit and proud of the Motor City. I still root for the Detroit Tigers and all my hometown teams. And the question is selective. It's asked only of some of us, and it denies us the opportunity, the right to be the agents of our own destiny, to write the script of our own story, to say who we are. You can bet if you ask people who are confident that they belong to the majority and mainstream, "Where are you really from?" They would be flummoxed by the question. They would say, "Well, I just told you, I'm from the heartland, the American Midwest. What do you mean by challenging me in that way?" There's been much talk of the clash of civilizations. The issues that we face now can be traced to the work of two Harvard professors. There was a fellow who passed away, Samuel Huntington. He was a distinguished scholar. Some have unkind things to say about him, but I would rather respect him and his work and engage with him. He wrote an article uh, in the 1990s for Foreign Affairs magazine, and then he turned it into a book. It's called Clash of Civilizations. You might have heard of this. It was a bestseller, especially after the tragedy and the terrorist attacks of 9/11. For you see, in Clash of Civilizations, Huntington presented a thesis. He said, we will face a cataclysmic battle. He didn't just mean culturally, he didn't just mean economically, he didn't just mean politically, he meant militarily. He meant a shooting war, not a cold war, a hot war. People killed one another, sought to conquer others' lands. And he predicted that this would happen between three contending powers: the West, led by the United States, Islam, and China. Because of 9/11, people emphasized the clash between the West, the United States, and Islam. But if you go back and look at Huntington's work, he actually predicted that China would be the next enemy as well. It'd be a three-way fight for global supremacy. This was followed by the work of Graham Allison. This you probably have seen. If you follow US-China relations at all, a few years ago, Allison, who had earlier written a leading study of the Cuban Missile Crisis, holds a chair at Harvard, a scholar and teacher who's renowned, he wrote a book about the Thucydides trap. Before he wrote the book, people probably had forgotten that there had been once a Greek general and poet. The Greeks had generals who could be poets or poets who could be generals by the name of Thucydides, who studied the Peloponnesian War. And what Graham Allison did was he looked at more than a dozen cases throughout human history, in the annals of recorded human history, where there's been an established power and a rising power. And in most, not all, in most, that resulted in military conflict. And so he called this the Thucydides trap. And the example that he wanted to look at and study seriously is the United States as a hegemonic power with global influence after World War II. And in 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the demise of the former Soviet Union, leaving the United States the sole superpower until in the past decade, in an economic change that the world has never seen, China lifted so many people out of poverty with such sustained economic growth. And this was the latest scenario that Allison thought would present a test of whether Thucydides had been right, that when you have an established power and rising power, that this type of conflict is inevitable. Well, this has not gone unnoticed in the nation's capital. And in 2018, one of the very last acts of then Attorney General Jeff Sessions, time passes so quickly, we might have forgotten, Sessions was a Trump ally who was appointed to be Attorney General. They had a falling out, and Trump's comeback is being opposed by Sessions' comeback is being opposed by Trump himself. But at the time, Sessions was the Attorney General. One of his very last acts was to announce what they called the China Initiative at the end of 2018. There had been earlier signs and simultaneous announcements of many similar notions of a threat. What Sessions announced was that the Department of Justice would begin aggressive enforcement of a set of policies based on the supposition that China was engaged in espionage, both real military espionage at the behest of the People's Liberation Army, as well as commercial espionage, trade espionage, theft of intellectual property, and other behaviors that violated US law. At the same time, the FBI director, Christopher Wray, testifying before Congress, said, and some of you may know this, that the Chinese use what he called unconventional collectors of intelligence. And he was very specific. He meant students, that's what he said, visiting scholars, professors. He said that these are folks who, and the hypothesis is, they're not professional spies. This isn't James Bond or Jason Bourne. This is someone who's coming to study for their master's degree or PhD, or pretending to do so. And along the way, they gather information from their professors' labs and so on and so forth. And they spirit it out of the United States for the benefit of the People's Republic of China or for state-owned enterprises and so on. So Sessions announced the China Initiative. Ray said that Chinese used unconventional collectors. And then President Trump himself at a private dinner said that almost all Chinese coming to the United States are spies. So this isn't just my opinion. This is the stated view of the federal government. I would say, for those of you who are Mandarin speakers, 美国的政府觉得中国人都是间谍. I've practiced that line too. American government officials regard all Chinese people as spies. That's the context. Let me now turn to the third and final part of this talk, what that means. So you've probably seen, especially if you're a professor or work in the STEM field, science, technology, engineering, and math, that the China Initiative has been going strong, and the government has doubled down. They've announced that we should expect even more prosecutions. And they've announced dozens of convictions or plea deals, including people who are doing coronavirus-related research who were driven out. ProPublica ran an article about a biologist who had a lab here and who, because of these policies, had to leave and now is in China at the forefront of the research. I would say these cases fall into three categories. So let me describe these categories and take a moment to talk about scale and then conclude and open up for questions. The three categories are A, real cases. I always try to be clear when I talk about this. As a scholar who has studied this, as a lawyer, I have no doubt. I am convinced, and I've reviewed the files of these cases. I've looked at the newspaper articles. There are people who have done something wrong. I have no doubt about that. And I want to say, as a loyal American, they should be investigated, they should be prosecuted, they should be punished according to due process. They shouldn't be persecuted. We have to wonder about the chilling effect on everyone else who has a similar surname or looks vaguely like them because of this issue of you all look alike, as we used to hear growing up. But I want to be absolutely clear about this category. Real cases, they're not misunderstandings. They're not somebody who somehow something was lost in translation and they didn't understand. It's not negligence, it's not recklessness, it's a conspiracy, just as the prosecutors say, where people have tried to hide payments, where they've set up shell corporations, where they've moved things around in a surreptitious manner, and where you couldn't help but, when you look at this, say this had to have been intentional, and they sought to benefit someone inappropriately. Sometimes it's themselves. Perhaps they've learned American norms too much. It's a get-rich-quick scheme where they go to work at a company and they want to take its ideas for themselves and set up a competitor despite a non-compete and contract and so on. So that category of cases I want to acknowledge, A, real cases. B, there are terrible instances of racial profiling, not one, not two, but many. The ones that you've probably read about, they've been in the New York Times, they've been on 60 Minutes. There's Professor Shi, Xiaoxing Shi of Temple University, former chair of the physics department, doing great research. The FBI broke his door down, went into his house, handcuffed him, dragged him away in front of his family, and accused him of being a spy. Shi, by the way, is a naturalized US citizen. So while foreign born, he is no longer a Chinese national. And he's someone who raised his children here, had his career here. If you look at his life, it's no different than your own, my parents. This is somebody who became an American, put down new roots, and as it turned out, had done nothing wrong. The government, embarrassed, dropped all the charges because they'd gotten confused and they were accusing Dr. Xi of stealing his own ideas. Um, there was just no case. The only thing that would have caused suspicion, aside from their own ignorance of the science, was his ancestry, his heritage, his ethnicity, his identity. Same is true of Sherry Chen, also a naturalized citizen. She is a mid-level weather forecaster. Her specialty is predicting floods, working for the American National Weather Service, living in rural Ohio. Again, someone who is settled here, whose life is as ordinary as could be, but whose name was dragged through the mud and whose career was wrecked. Why? Because she visited China to see her elderly, ailing mother. And upon her return, a co-worker reported her as a foreigner, which isn't true, and as a spy. Again, charges brought. She was accused of the most terrible crimes. On the eve of trial, all the charges were dropped because she wasn't a spy. This isn't just that she was acquitted, that she is entitled to be presumed innocent. The charges were dropped. The government walked away from the case. They nonetheless fired her, and in an appeal to what's called the Merit Systems Protection Board, she won. In a type of case where fewer than 1 out of 50, probably close to 1 out of 100 employees of federal government in the civil service win cases like that. In a more than 130-page opinion, the administrative law judge said that Sherry Chen had been subject to a gross miscarriage of justice. Didn't find express racial animus, but did find that she was entitled to be restored to her job. Those two cases are not the only cases. When you look at the other cases, it's striking how many of these cases that started off with claims of espionage turn out to just be accounting cases, turn out to be anything but espionage. Despite people being fired, having their careers ruined, and having all their files seized and being searched, the best that the government can come up with is, for example, moonlighting without appropriate permission. There's a climate researcher. His case was written up in the Washington Post. Chun-Tsai Wang, fascinating case. Again, a U.S. citizen, yes, from China, but naturalized, which to those viewing this, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing even unusual about that. It was once to be commended. You came and you wanted to become a citizen. You studied for that test. You passed. You swore allegiance. We applaud you, right? Well, Chun-Tsai Wang was a leading and is a leading climate change researcher working for the U.S. government. And 3 different summers, it is true, while on vacation, he visited China and went to Ocean University to serve as a distinguished lecturer and visitor, gave some talks, supervised some students, for which he was paid the grand sum of, get this, $700 US each of those summers, $2,100. He should have reported it. Query whether this is a criminal felony or whether it's the sort of thing that if he had been different, someone would have pulled him aside and said, you need to redo your forms. This is a problem. Or if he would have faced some discipline. But instead, he faced the full force of the U.S. Attorney's Office, ultimately pled, and the federal judge presiding over the case. You can take a look at the transcript. You can find it online. This never happens. The federal judge accepting the plea deal said to him, I'm sorry I have to preside over your case. She says, I regret. My only regret in this case is that I have to preside over it. And she said, you're always welcome back to the United States. You're a citizen. Your family is here. And she sentenced him for what the government had said was a terrible crime to 1 night in prison, which he had already served while awaiting trial. So I've told you about a few of these cases. There's so many more, and I've just limited myself just to the facts and the record of the case. And if you take a look, it's just shocking. The third category of case are those with double or changing standards. Those of you in higher education know this. Think back to 10 years ago. Oh, for that matter, think back to 5 years ago, or even 3 years ago. Every major American college or university, public or private, wherever it was located, wanted a Chinese partner. They wanted collaboration. They wanted to bring Chinese students. Who did they turn to? Their ethnic Chinese faculty and staff to go back to their ancestral land and to negotiate an agreement of some sort. So the participation in talent programs, all of that, it used to be the sort of thing that your home university here in the United States would brag about. They would say, our faculty are so good, they've been selected by China to be part of this program. Just look at the pages of Nature and Science magazine, and you'll see that this is written about in very positive terms until a sea change in attitude, a 180-degree change. So conduct that was formerly encouraged, not just a few years ago, became, well, people were neutral about it, and then it was frowned upon, then it became prohibited, then it became criminal. I'd be hard-pressed to find another type of conduct that professors engage in that so quickly turn from the norm to something that you could be put in prison for doing. The government touts its figures, and I have no doubt it has secured convictions or plea deals in dozens of cases. Understand, though, with 350,000 people coming from China every year, well, let's say 1% were guilty of transgression. And this is part of the general problem with scale that Americans, including Chinese Americans, have when they think about China. You know, when I first went to China, and I didn't go to mainland China until I was well into my 30s. I think I may even have been in my 40s. When I landed at the Beijing airport, I thought, wow, you could take the entirety of a major American airport, including the runways, and put them into one of the terminals of the Beijing airport. If you've ever ridden either a bus or a train in from the farthest part of the tarmac into the terminal, it can be a 45-minute ride, and you're thinking to yourself, am I still in the airport? When the coronavirus started and there were all these rumors that it came out of a wet market in Wuhan, and there's no question it does have origins related to Wuhan. Many Americans had never heard of Wuhan, which is officially a second-tier Chinese city. Well, Wuhan is bigger than all but New York and Los Angeles, depending on how exactly you measure. People don't realize there are 100 cities in China with populations more than 1 million. And so scale, the point here is scale is so different. So let's take 350,000 Chinese students coming per year. Let's say 1% of them are up to no good. Now, don't get me wrong. That is a problem. That's 3,500 cases. That would be multiple cases at every four-year college of any repute within this nation. That's serious. 3,500, but that would only be 1% of the Chinese foreign national population, to say nothing of Chinese Americans, native born and naturalized. So we have difficulty understanding the scale, that the absolute numbers can be big, but 99% of people of Chinese descent, you and me, those of us on this call, we're just ordinary folks trying to make it through our lives. We're not spies, we're not thieves of trade secrets, we're not sleeper agents or foreign agents. We were not sent by Beijing or anyone else. We're just ordinary folks like our neighbors and coworkers, and some of us are thoroughly assimilated and sixth generation. But that's what's so difficult to explain to people, because the model minority myth, the idea that Asian Americans are super successful, which just generates racial resentment, and the perpetual foreigner syndrome, the idea that no matter how hard you try to imitate your social superiors, well, you're just trying too hard. You don't quite fit in. I'll close with this thought. This moment is fraught. It feels as if a reckoning is upon us. And as we look at this pandemic, as we shelter in place in our homes with kith and kin, it makes us think about these issues. As we look at the protests, the ongoing protests, and so many Asian Americans wonder, with Black Lives Matter, what does that mean? Are we white? Are we black? Are we people of color? Are we trying to be honorary whites? Are we perpetual foreigners? How do we fit into this? I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I do know it is important to ask this question and to acknowledge that the community has many different answers, yours as valid as mine. Will Chinese Americans be stuck in the middle of US-China conflict? From the 500 people who signed up for this webinar, let me express both my gratitude and my sense that this weighs heavily on our minds. It isn't just about our own identity, it isn't about racial etiquette or political correctness. It's about whether we have made the right choice, us, our children and grandchildren, those of us who are not ethnic nationalists, who have said, I am an American. Will others believe that? Or on both sides of the Pacific, will they laugh and be skeptical? Will they prosecute and persecute? And perhaps even if war comes, people have speculated, will there be internment camps again? Will we stand up and speak out for ourselves effectively, persuasively to our neighbors and coworkers? That is the question I put to you. And I look forward to your questions to me and your thoughts about what the answer might be. And I know you'll be the moderator of our discussion. We have about 15 minutes, and thank you so very much. I'm gratified to be doing this for the University of California, Berkeley Chinese Alumni Association. And yes, go Bears.
Yes. Thank you so much, Frank, for giving us a condensed timeline of Chinese American history here and the fast changing current situation. I see that many of our listeners are engaging in conversation by themselves here, but let me pose a couple of questions that were submitted beforehand. You know, in the 1970s, and I had heard that the Vincent Chin case was a seminal event that made you personally aware of the Asian Americans' challenges in America. And at the time, Americans were afraid of and despised the rise of Japan economically. And today, Americans are afraid of and despise the rise of China economically and politically. And just a few days ago, actually, someone defaced the San Francisco Chinatown restaurant sign and put 1975 Japan on it. I don't know if you saw that. What differences do you see between America's treatment of Asian Americans in the 70s and now? And as a follow-on, how should Chinese Americans prepare to confront and defend ourselves against racial prejudice from both emotional and physical points of view?
So some of you know the case, but not everyone does. Vincent Chin, who the anniversary of his death just passed. Let me tell you a little bit about his case. I didn't know Chin, but he was killed on June 19th, 1982 in Detroit. And I know that time and I know that place. I grew up maybe a dozen miles from where it all went down. Briefly, Vincent Chin was Chinese American. He was of Chinese descent. He'd been adopted from an orphanage in Hong Kong at a young age by a Chinese American who had served the United States in World War II. And his wife, who had come from China, they weren't able to have children. They adopted Vincent, and he grew up in modest circumstances. He wasn't the model minority. He was not a whiz kid rocket scientist. He was just an ordinary guy. And that's an important, indeed compelling part of his story. He had dropped out of college. He'd gone back to technical school. He was going to learn to be a draftsman. And meanwhile, he worked as a waiter at a Chinese restaurant, just like his father before him. He'd met a nice young lady, and they were due to be married. So he did what other guys do. He had a bachelor's party. He was no saint, and I think that's actually important to acknowledge because he was just a guy. He rounded up some buddies of his, and it's important to mention just two facts that are part of the context, because none of this ever happens in a vacuum. As you mentioned, there was a great fear of Japan back then. People don't remember this, but there was a terrible recession. We've now surpassed it, but the recession in the 70s and 80s, it was terrible. Unemployment was in the double digits. Inflation was in the double digits. And you could only buy gas on certain days because OPEC had called an oil embargo. So some of you may recall this, right? People would get into fistfights at gas stations, depending on whether your license plate had a digit that ended in an odd or even number. New York City virtually was bankrupt, just as one sign of this terrible malaise. And it was blamed on Japan because Japan seemed like it was going to take over. The Japanese were buying major sports teams. They're buying American real estate, landmarks. The Japanese companies were buying their American competitors. And this was a nation that had been defeated, vanquished during World War II. They were known for making cheap transistor radios, but some of these imported cars came in by the container shipload. And people who would have laughed at you, they would have said, what are you doing with that piece of Jap crap if you'd bought a Toyota or Subaru or Honda? Those weren't names that people could even pronounce. They'd make fun of that little car, that imported car, that four-cylinder. It's not a big, mighty American V8 engine. And Detroit, remember, is the Motor City. Everyone there made cars. If you didn't, your neighbors did. That's why I was there. My father was an engineer. He got a PhD and he went to work at one of the big four US automakers when that was the best job you could have in the world. So it was even worse then. People called it an economic Pearl Harbor, and using terms that are similar to what they talk about today. It's hard to believe all this because the economic bubble burst, right, for Japan, and their economy has been in the doldrums for all of more modern memory for the past 25 years. But there was a moment people thought Japan was going to take over. Look at the Back to the Future movies, for example. That's where Michael J. Fox travels back and forth in time. In those movies, in the future, his boss is always an Asian guy. It's always a Japanese guy. In Back to the Future 2, I think it is, his Japanese boss sends a fax, you're fired, right? So that's the fear, that's the anxiety of the white working man. I'll answer to a Japanese boss. There was a congressman in the Motor City used to give speeches that said, he said, you know who's to blame for your economic woes? Little yellow men. That's what he said. So back to Chin. He was the victim of mistaken identity twice over. Remember, Chinese, not Japanese, American, not foreign, but his attackers who killed him by bludgeoning him to death with a baseball bat. They used racial slurs, same ones I remember, the common cruelty of childhood, the bullying of the playground. You know those words, chink and Jap, nip, which you don't even hear anymore. And then one of them wound up saying, and pardon the language, this is what witnesses said, you little motherfucker, it's because of you motherfuckers that we're out of work. And his attackers, two white auto workers, a father and a stepson, using this baseball bat, literally cracked his skull open, and with blood and spinal fluid and cerebral matter pulling onto the pavement beneath him, he uttered the last words, "It's not fair." So this isn't just someone's hurt feelings, and we've seen physical attacks on people of Asian descent because of COVID-19. In Texas, a family of Burmese background, including children, was attacked by a knife-wielding assailant who blamed them for the pandemic. Burmese, not Chinese, Americans, not foreigners. These are all the themes that we see again and again and again. And they're about which side are you on? Because we have that face of the enemy. I admire especially those Asian American soldiers in World War II and the Vietnam conflict who had to go into battle fearful that friendly fire would result in their death, that someone wearing the same uniform they had on would believe that they were the enemy. So many reported in basic training, for example, that they were pulled aside by the drill sergeant and told, make like a gook so that we know what the enemy looks like. The question, what should we do? Build bridges. This is why it's so important to me to be a good ally to the Black Lives Matter movement, to see that this is about principle. That's the same problems that if we care about racial profiling of scientists doing science while Asian, we have to care about driving while Black. We have to think about that case of the bird watcher, Mr. Cooper, in Central Park, who had 911 called on him. And when you watch the video, you would have to say, okay, this is a guy who's bird watching. I can't think of a more nerdy admirable pastime than bird watching in a public park, and a woman, white, who panics because this bird watcher happens to be a black man. She's at least polite enough to, when she calls and tries frantically to get the police to come, to say African American man. But it's apparent that her panic is driven by nothing other than race. It isn't random. So to be a good ally requires not appropriating other people's suffering for ourselves, but understanding that, yes, Chinese Americans were lynched. Yes, we need to raise our voices. But at this particular moment, we should march with and alongside, and yes, possibly behind African Americans who bear the brunt of these racial disparities that we see. And when you see the documentary evidence, you cannot deny the abstract disparity. You can say, oh, well, people can make excuses. But when you watch, you have to avert your gaze because it's so powerful, this evidence. In 1989, Spike Lee made this movie. It was Incendiary. People praised it, they condemned it. Do the Right Thing. It shows police brutality of a sort that was regarded as exaggerated and ficticious, but really is quite similar to the videos that people are now capturing, the citizen journalists with their smartphones. And there is an angry crowd that gathers. They're angry for a reason. They're angry because they've witnessed someone killed in front of them by police using a chokehold, and they won't stand for it. Who would? There's an Asian shopkeeper, if you watch this movie, and he's worried this crowd that they're going to come and burn down his store. And he comes out, me black, like you, same. So he has an accent, and he claims to be an ally. And in a poignant moment, the crowd relaxes for just that second, because they see in him that they do have, however distant, something in common, and they don't proceed to attack him or his small business. I wonder to myself, will we see moments like that? Will we be accepted? Do we want to be? I'll be honest, among friends, one of the things that most troubles me is when I'm among Asian Americans and they themselves will express bigotry. Sometimes it's toward African Americans or Latinos. Sometimes it's Chinese talking about other Asian ethnicities. Sometimes it's Mandarin speakers talking about Cantonese speakers, or Cantonese speakers talking about Mandarin speakers, and so on. It's astonishing, these divisions. And it's both out of principle and pragmatism that I would say the answer to the question, what do we do? It's we build bridges. Look at Andrew Yang. Look at Gary Locke before him. Gary Locke, the first Chinese American to be the U.S. ambassador to China. He was in the cabinet. He was twice the governor of Washington State. Gary Locke would not have been elected and reelected if you rounded up every Chinese American and they all pledged to vote for him. If he rounded up all Asian Americans, they all pledged to vote for him. That wouldn't carry the day. He had to build bridges, and he was successful. He reached out across partisan lines, racial lines, class lines, and he said, look, I'm going to do a good job for you as a servant leader. He's a hero of mine. So when you look at the Asian Americans who have succeeded in these leadership roles, let me say just a word about the late Chancellor Chang Lin-tin, who was the first Asian American to head a major research university. More than 20 years ago, he was taken from us far too early. As people say, if I see far, it's because I stand on the shoulders of giants. Chancellor Tin was a huge Bears fan, of course. His story was one of bridge building. He was a scientist who was a serious scholar, but he was an affable guy who would walk across campus and smile and talk to just about everyone. That was the way he succeeded as a leader. I remember he used to give speeches about how when he came to the United States in the 50s, just around the time the Supreme Court decided Brown versus Board of Education during the historic struggle for Black equality. The buses were segregated, and he didn't know when he got on a bus to ride the whites in the front or the blacks in the back. And he was so discomfited by that he ended up walking. That is what he did, because he wasn't going to partake of the privilege, even if sometimes they would let him be up front. And he had this uneasy position, and so he resolved it for himself. We Asian Americans face that moral dilemma daily as a community and as individuals. And I can tell you, I know where I stand. That doesn't mean that you have to make the same decision, but I would say this: we, in this moment, we know this is historical. We're always living through history. We just rarely catch ourselves and say this is a historic moment. But we have the pandemic, we had COVID-19, we have the Me Too movement. All these things are happening where we know our children and grandchildren will ask, what was it like? What were you doing? How did you contribute? And I'd rather be on the right side of history than the wrong. We have time, I think, just for one more question.
One more. Yes. Thank you for that. There are lots of questions. I'll select one, which is a little more actionable, hopefully. There are lots of issues, as you mentioned, but what can we do as besides building bridges on a personal basis? Are there organizations that are helping to educate Americans and against racial prejudice that we can support, that we as Chinese Americans can support them?
Absolutely. So I've been doing some work with Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Washington, D.C. This is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, respected advocacy group. There's an Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Los Angeles. There's Asian Law Caucus in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is part of the same network. A few years ago, they all decided they would come together. And what they do is advocacy. It's both grassroots. It involves work on Capitol Hill to influence policy. And they've set up a project to look at these issues. There's a fellow there, you might have seen him on TV, by the name of John Yang. He and I have worked together for decades now. And they're looking to really help people in need. You know, just about every week, I get an email or a phone call from another Chinese American, Chinese immigrant, a visiting scholar who's doing good work, who says, you know, I've done nothing wrong, but now the NIH is investigating. Now the general counsel of my university has contacted me. What should I do? And I worry that even though there are those real cases that we must investigate and prosecute, that there's this terrible chilling effect, and people are being sent a message that those young people of Chinese descent who are ambitious, who have options, who could become Americans, who could contribute here, who could be another Nobel Prize winner, like so many in the generations before them, they will now choose not to come, and it will be our loss. It is in the American national interest to continue to recruit to these shores people like all of you, like your parents, like my parents, so that we can advance this nation, and ultimately, because America is that city upon a hill, a beacon of hope and opportunity, be a model and contribute. We can contribute by bridge building. The people who call me to a person, I always ask them, you know, what are your goals? Your career goals, your life goals. You know what? They want to be Americans. They have green cards or they've naturalized. They want to stay here. That's what they want to fight for. That's what they've sacrificed for. Look at, you know, I'm a hardworking guy, I think, but I'm nothing compared to my parents. The sacrifices they made, and that's true of all of you and those of you with children. You know, your kids are slackers compared to you. I was a Chinese school dropout. No matter how hard I work, I know, and I have to respect my parents, my elders, they work so much harder. They gave up everything so that we could make it here. That story is so poignant, and it is like so many others It's like people of Jewish background, people who are Italian, people who have migrated from the world over. It's like people who come across the southern border who are no different than anyone else. They just want to make a better life for themselves and a better world for their children. So, yes, there are organizations. We must stand up and speak out. We have to recognize that in America, unlike Asia, in this diverse democracy, it's about participation and it's about being effective when we participate. Asian cultures all have a proverb. You know, the Japanese one's the best known. The nail that sticks up is pounded down. That encourages deference to tradition. It encourages being quiet, trying to fit in. There's a Chinese saying, the loudest duck is shot first by the hunter, right? That's about being quiet. It's about not making a fuss. Compare that to the American adage, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. That's what we have to recognize, that we have to adapt, and that the strategy here should be just like our forebears, that we will pursue equality in every way. I look at the work of W.E.B. Du Bois with his talented 10th, a race man, an advocate for African Americans, one of the founders of the NAACP. He talked about not settling. He demanded that in every sphere, African Americans were equal to whites and had to pursue that, and that those who had made it had in turn a duty to help others up that same ladder of success. I would borrow from that. It is the same project for Chinese immigrants and their American-born children, no different than for others. It is to establish ourselves here, and along the way, to help to build bridges to the land of our ancestors, to say to people that there is a better course than to continue to ratchet tensions up for no apparent reason other than perhaps self-gain, that we can do better than this in the service of humanity. So again, I'm just so humbled and honored, and I know we have to be mindful of time, and I want to thank you personally. It's really been a pleasure. The questions I've asked are law professors' questions. There is no right answer, and I hope I've stimulated conversation that after this event closes, that you will talk over over your dinner or breakfast with your family members about whether Chinese Americans are stuck in the middle, and how instead of being there, we can be agents of change and help improve this world around us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Wu. Thank you, Frank, for sharing your time, knowledge, and wisdom with us today, and a call to action for every one of us. We wish you the best in your new role in New York City next week.
Thank you.
And thank you all for tuning in today. We didn't get through many of your questions, but we're glad that you have all connected with each other online that I see. And a recording of this event will be available on our Chinese chapter website, which I'm putting in the chat box again. Please go on our website to add your email to our list, and we will be bringing you more virtual events of interest in the coming months. In the meantime, we hope you all stay safe and see you again soon. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.